Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sophia Sestito, and as a member of the Young Construction Leaders and the TCA's Environmental Committee, I'd like to welcome you all to our event this morning. We have 4 industry specialists here today who will be sharing their experience over the recent 6 months on early engagement and soil management. I'd like to welcome your moderator this morning, Matt Gardner, is partner at Willms and Shier, and is a specialist in environmental law. Matt, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to the TCA team and the TCA's Young Construction Leaders Committee for putting this all together and inviting us to speak. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping matters. Everyone attending our webinar today is muted, so to ask questions, please type them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Our panel will take us through a brief overview of their key insights into excess soil management and the importance of early engagement in excess soil planning. That's the theme today. And they'll speak from 4 different stakeholder perspectives, which is going to be very helpful for covering the landscape for excess soil now that we're 6 months into it. After this, we'll be glad to answer your questions. Feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A tab at any time, and we'll discuss them after we go through the presentations. Our event today is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with attendees after the event, so you will have the slides through that and also this entire presentation and the points discussed. So we have a terrific panel of industry experts with us today. First, we have Neil Isenegger, is a professional engineer, pre-construction manager with Menard, Canada. And Neil's been working in the Ontario geotechnical industry for about a dozen years, over a dozen years. And Neil has particular experience executing design, build, ground improvement projects. So Neil's going to speak to us today from that sort of foundation industry perspective. We have Mark Priddle, who's a senior consultant, professional geoscientist, and a QP, a qualified person under the Excess Soil Regulation and the Environmental Protection Act. And Mark is with McIntosh Perry. Mark has over 35 years experience providing leadership, senior technical support in environmental site assessments, in site remediation, excess soil management, environmental assessments, hydrology, hydrogeology, geotechnical, biology, ecology, he covers it all. And he's a senior advisor specifically for excess soil management on numerous construction projects dealing with bridges, with buildings, with roads, provides advice on segregation, handling, and disposal of excess soils. Ryan Moniz is the Director of Business Development for GFL's Soil Division and a Project Director for GFL's very unique new product. It's a soil management software known as PATH. Ryan's been working with the environmental industry his entire career and has been an active participant with ONEA, the Ontario Environmental Industry Association, assisting that group and those who are members of ONEA to get the word out about best management guidance and practices for stakeholders to better understand the new excess soil regulation and the new excess soil rules that we're going to speak to today. And then finally, we have Kevin Goldberg, who's the president and co-founder of SoilFLO. And SoilFLO is a cloud-based software centered on Project Earthworks. Contractors, QPs, owners, all of those stakeholders in the process for excess soil can easily collaborate on the SoilFLO platform to more efficiently manage haulers, to track site progress, and meet the new tracking requirements under our excess soil regulation and soil rules. So to kick things off, I thought it would be helpful on our next slide to just run through briefly what comprises our new excess soil laws and guidance in Ontario. And I think Vishan's just going to put up the next slide now. So here's the list of 5 laws, and then the 6th bullet point is guidance. So I just wanted to set the framework and the stage for our presenters today by describing the legal aspects in a nutshell of what this whole regime, as I call it, but suite of laws and guidance consists of. So first we have the excess soil management regulation itself, which we'll speak to as the regulation or the excess soil regulation when we discuss it today. And it's the foundational element, it's the core piece. It's promulgated under the Environmental Protection Act in Ontario, and it really drives the process and sets out the framework. We have amendments to 3 different regulations. So first we have amendments to the Record of Site Condition regulation, and some of those amendments at the same time as they were made for excess soil were made to help streamline and facilitate getting records of site condition. We're not going to speak to that today, but the piece that dovetails with excess soil is making sure that excess soil can be brought to a site that already has a record of site condition or is getting a record of site condition, and the standards that apply for excess soil can be used to ensure that that process works fluidly. So that's one set of amendments. The other set of amendments that were made to two of our waste regulations, Reg 347, which is the general waste management, big waste management regulation, and then OREG 351/12, were made to, again, dovetail with excess soil and waste, and in particular, even to remove requirements for having to get an environmental compliance approval for hauling of excess soil. So again, a facilitating of moving excess soil without having to go through a permit process, which is good for business. We have the rules for soil management called the soil rules. And within the same document, the soil rules are the first half. Second half is a series of tables. Those tables include the generic excess soil quality standards, which are similar to our generic site condition standards under OREG 15304, the record of site condition regulation, but they're mostly, for the most part, more stringent for excess soil, but similar. And then last but not least, in terms of the law, we have the BRAT, as it's known, the Beneficial Reuse Assessment Tool, which allows for qualified persons like Mark Priddle to generate site-specific risk-based standards for sites that may allow for higher concentrations of contaminants to be at a site, at a reuse site, when you're bringing excess soil to that final reuse site for final beneficial reuse and placement, than as set out in the excess soil quality standards, the generic standards. And then there's a rationale document for reuse of excess soil at reuse sites. It's guidance, it's not law. I think it's handy in particular for consultants. But that's the framework, 5 pieces of law and guidance, so that you have the overview. So one of the central themes we're going to talk about today is pre-planning and early engagement in excess soil management with all of the parties involved, from generators at the start, the project leaders of the generator site of excess soil, to the haulers, to those interim sites who may be storing or processing soil, and then finally for final placement at the reuse site at the end of the day, the receiving site. And that engagement, that early engagement with all of those parties is really critical. You're going to hear this from our panelists today as a theme that's echoed throughout, because you need all of those parties to be online and engaged with early when you're dealing with excess soil, and we'll hear why. So I'm going to turn it over to Neil Isenegger to speak to excess soil management from the foundation industry's perspective, the benefits of reusing soil, keeping soil in place at your project area or the generator site, and some early engagement strategies. Over to you, Neil.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And thanks to the Toronto Construction Association and the Young Construction Leaders for putting this on. I think it's going to be a good panel. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Menard Canada, we are a specialty design build ground improvement contractor working in 80 countries around the world, a subsidiary of Vinci Construction, which is the largest publicly traded construction company in the world. So here in Canada, formerly operating as Geopac, established in 1971, so that's 50 years of history, trying to tackle some of the worst soil conditions that we can find and deliver effective solutions that, as Matt said, allow people to leave soils in place, get back to standard strip and spread footings, high capacity foundations, and reduce your excess soils that will be generated on the site. We have 6 offices across Canada, including 3 here in Ontario, Hamilton, Toronto, and Ottawa, and manage about 75 projects per year. So just a little bit about, I guess, excess soils from the foundation industry perspective. I think that really the messaging here is that, weak and compressible or unsuitable soils can become excess soils when you're trying to develop on parcels of land, whether that's through bulk excavation, engineered fill operations, deep foundation construction such as caissons and CFA piles that pull a lot of soil out of the ground. When you're dealing with challenging soil conditions, you're often part of that process is going to be typically generating excess soils with conventional methods. Some excess soil generation, of course, is unavoidable. So if the development plan necessitates basements, for example, you're going to need to dig and generate soil. Certainly your footing construction, your servicing, there's typically always some level of excess soils that will be managed. but we will talk a little bit about some strategies that will help you to greatly reduce or eliminate some of that soil generation. So I think from a holistic project review, it's about, as we said, early engagement. So working very closely with your project team, working very closely early on with your geotechnical engineer to understand what soils you have on site, what challenges that you have, and potential ways that you can manage them. Right. Some typical issues are, you know, uncontrolled fill, or like we mentioned, weak and compressible soil layers, where you're typically asked to either remove it or go through it with some sort of deep foundation system. So one of the things that we at Menard look at early on with project teams is, you know, what are the options that are available to you. So the earlier, and I think the highlight of this panel discussion is all about early engagement. But the earlier that you can bring your professionals on board, bring your geotechnical engineer, your environmental engineer, engage with your specialty subcontractors, you can really start early on in the process to identify opportunities to perhaps leave soil in place or to minimize the amount of soil that you have. So some options may be, you know, modifying your site grades. Does it make sense to raise the site grade to avoid having to dig through poor soils? Are you able to potentially relocate some of your structures to better areas of the site? Does it make sense to collect higher resolution geotechnical data to try to better understand what the challenges that you're facing are, and make sure you have a very clear and complete understanding of what challenges that you face. And then, of course, you know, from our perspective, it's about looking at ground improvement methods. So a number of different techniques. We won't have time to talk about them all, but the idea here is to reinforce, strengthen, stiffen soils in place to avoid generating any excess soils, to avoid having to over excavate for your footings, avoiding, you know, piles, caissons, etc. And then also not only avoiding it, but bringing that soil up to a very high bearing capacity, which shrinks the sizes of your foundations, which further reduces the amount of soil that you generate on site. A number of different ways that this can be achieved. Some techniques are better suited to some soil conditions than others. For example, soil densification through impact energy or vibrations. You see here, you know, rapid impact compaction, dynamic compaction, doing a lot of work with this in Ontario, out on job sites right now. You know, basically pounding away, beating the soil up, taking conditions that may be loose or unsuitable, densifying to them a level that would be acceptable to accept the development. You can also look at what we call aggregate piers. So this is a reinforcement technique. So when maybe dynamic compaction falls short, the soil conditions aren't quite appropriate, you can look at adding compacted columns of granular into the ground. There's a number of different ways that we can manage it. Everything from crane mounted equipment that can, you know, treat 30 plus meters of depth, down to, you know, very nimble excavator mounted equipment that can move in and out of site quite effectively. And then controlled modulus columns. And I think we're seeing quite a lot of work with this in Ontario. And what's really exciting about this process is that it's completely vibration free, doesn't generate any soils, produces very high capacity for foundations using a displacement auger, again, so pushing the soil laterally as opposed to removing it from the hole and injecting a column of concrete or a grout into the ground. So there's a lot of different ways that we can manage poor soils that allow you to leave them in place and avoid generating that excess soils. And the earlier that you engage with your you know, geotechnical professionals, with your specialty subcontractors, typically the more value that can be driven on your job site. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I love the pictures and very, very interesting insights into how, in particular, you can reuse and not have to generate excess soil, but can use excavated soil on site at your project area and not have to go through the process of taking it to another site and the legwork that goes with that. So now we're going to have Mark Priddle from McIntosh Perry speak to public and private sector issues in dealing with these new excess soil laws so far, 6 months in, and tips for preventing these types of issues from arising from Mark's experience as an environmental consultant and also a qualified person, a QP. Take it away, Mark.
Yeah, thanks Matt and Toronto Construction Association. Just a bit of background on McIntosh Perry. We're a consultant. We deal mostly with the owner or the project leader now, as it's referred to in the excess soils regulation. I do environmental geoscience. Trying to get this to go. Oh, there we go. So I'm an advisor both internally and externally within McIntosh Perry's infrastructure vertical, and helping out with mainly public sector clients, Ministry of Transportation and municipalities. Had chats already this week about excess soils and early engagement, and in some cases trying to go back and figure things out once a tender has been issued and we're trying to comply with the regulation. I also provide advice to private sector developments that are dealing with excess soils generation and helping with investigation plans to classify soils, which is really an important part of the whole excess soils process. And sort of as a final stage, assist with tendering to address regulatory requirements to make sure tender has the information in it for contractors to bid on and the project leader to be covered with respect to the excess soils regulation. So again, excess soils, we've been dealing with the early adoption of these requirements with the MTO and other private sector clients, and just want to share some of the questions and experience, and they do definitely vary with our clients. So MTO is likely the largest single generator of excess soils in the province. They've had questions like, how can I minimize excess soils? We just heard this Neil talk about how you can do that if it's a geotechnically unsuitable soil, and how you can make sure it's not excess. We've also answered the question saying, can you use this for noise mitigation or visual berms in a project area? Been questions about the project area. It's a little bit different for linear infrastructure where you can have a long, narrow road allowance, and that you can define the project area and maybe make better use of excess soil or make use of soil so they're not excess. There's also sort of word on the street with our clients saying, are the contractors who have these reuse or transfer sites readily available around the province? And if yes, can we find out where they are and what can they accept? That question's a bit tough to answer. Sometimes it's a little bit of a trade secret as to what contractors have, and there definitely are, and there's more coming online. We'll hear about a GFL shortly coming up about that. MTO has asked us, can they transport excess soil between properties without following the regulation? That's a little bit of a gray area. If it's within the same project area, yes. Potentially if it stays on, again, this is not legal advice, if it stays on an MTO road allowance the whole way, it may not have to be treated as excess soil. The issue of a settlement area is important to municipalities and the MTO in that it does affect a project area. And how you deal with excess soils as a road might run completely through a settlement area which is under construction. From the private sector, we're getting questions about how does all this early characterization help me? And we're trying to suggest that it can minimize the cost that you spend on disposing of soil that doesn't have to be disposed of. It pushes you toward more unique ways of dealing with excess soils on site. The testing does seem expensive, that's correct, but there can be savings, and the regulation is designed to do this down the road with not having to cart soils around the province, both excess soils from the site and importing soils again to backfill. Does the phase 2 ASA provide enough information? Not necessarily. You do have to pay close attention to the regulation and follow some different testing procedures to make sure that you have a proper characterization and you fully understand what you can do with soils which will be accessed from your site. Natural background concentrations are interesting across the province. We're finding out that there's various metals which are elevated above certain standards and have to be dealt with. Soil tracking, we'll hear Kevin talk about that as an example. Another simple question, can I still take soil to a vacant lot with a clean fill wanted sign? The answer is essentially no, unless it's been developed properly as a site and signed off by a QP. Bidders requirements, we're suggesting to our clients that they should require an excess soil management plan with sampling and analysis. In a tender document, identify a qualified person by the contractor, and I think that's important if they're handling the soil. This is not downloading all the risk to the contractor, but it's knowing that they have someone who can assist with the regulation. One of the requirements is a soil destination, excess soil destination report, and a contractor will have to know where that soil is going and assist with the excess soil destination report, be able to talk about how they're going to handle soil in accordance with the regulation. Here are some other requirements that we're suggesting. You need to have a staging approach and methodology to deal with excavated and excess soils. Those two are different. Excavated doesn't necessarily mean it's excess under the regulation. It might be being reused on the site. A soil sampling and testing program. Again, if the site's not being characterized and you're stockpiling, you need a program to assess that. Provide guidance to a contractor about delineating soil in the field if work has already been done. Need to show that material, an important part of the regulation is that you're not taking clean soil to a landfill. So the QP has to be able to be identified that can say that this is suitable for a landfill, not some other reuse. Again, with the soil destination report, you need to identify temporary storage locations and measures to mitigate impacts. That's a sort of key underlying piece of the regulation. And identify those suitable receiving sites based on soil quality, whether it can go to, let's say, a residential site that needs fill for building up, or does it truly have to go to a landfill? And needs some kind of certification from a qualified person about no negative impact. So just in summary, when we're suggesting it's important to think ahead, get a QP on board early. That's both again for project leaders and in many cases a contractor as well. Follow the testing requirements for the excess soils regulation during the environmental site assessment stage helps a lot. I need to know which soil becomes excess. You don't want to do a lot of testing on soil which will actually be reused on site. That's a waste. And again, a key thing of the regulation is consider maximizing reuse of soil on site. Think out of the box. Talk to someone like Neil about how you can do that if there's geotechnical issues. For the project leader, the tender should clearly outline the process and biddable items related to excess soil. So if you know that some soil that's going to be excess can go to residential, clearly state that. Ask for a price for that, whereas you'll want a different price for something that's contaminated enough to have to go to a landfill. The excess soil management plan should be something that forms part of the bid and that the contractor is to provide. And have a plan for testing and tracking during construction. Very important that this is in place, and you'll hear more about that shortly. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Great tips. And on your point about the gray area of what is the project area, it's a good point and an interesting question, because the way the project area is defined is the site or adjoining properties. But if there's some space in between and they're not adjoining properties, then you fall outside the project area, and you would have to treat your soil that leaves that project area as excess soil. So a very good point, and something that I'm sure MTO has to think about when they're dealing with road allowances and so on. Okay, so we're going to go to Ryan Moniz now from GFL. Ryan's going to speak to how Ontario's new excess soil regulation and the soil rules support beneficial reuse of excess soil from the perspective, frankly, of multiple parties in the process: generators, the interim sites if you're storing or you're processing, and then receivers, the reuse sites that receive excess soils, and why it's particularly important, again, to engage early with those reuse sites as part of the process. Ryan.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, TCA, Mark, Neil, and Kevin, fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to be with an esteemed group here today, and to everyone listening in today and joining us, thank you. In relation to GFL, I think most of you have seen our green garbage trucks, the green excavators, green liquid vac trucks out there. So we are North America wide, publicly traded company, been in operation for over 10 years. Our soil operations, soil management side with MECP licensed facilities are going on its 14th, 15th year of operation. So we've been in the soil management game since day one of GFL's inception. In relation to excess soils, we cover a lot of different aspects of it as a generator through our shoring, excavation, civil, and environmental remediation division, ground force. We are also the receiver side with our facilities across Ontario, including 4 in Toronto area. And then we have liquid soil disposal facilities as well. A landfill out in Moose Creek, Ottawa area, and with the recent Terrapure acquisition, should be adding to our portfolio of receiver sites as well. And then inadvertently, we've become also a supplier of soil to help support the circular economy and beneficial reuse of these soils. So we've had a lot of projects that have excess soil and projects that have soil deficits. So essentially soil trading and helping supply those projects. In Ontario, last year we generated and managed over 4.5 million tons of soil, just to give you guys a sense of scale and how much soil is being moved across Ontario, and we're just one player. We support all different types of projects, from infrastructure, major infrastructure, real estate development, and contaminated sites. And especially with soil management, with the new regulation, there's a heightened emphasis on soil management, more responsibilities on the generators and the project leaders, which Mark mentioned, the owners of the soil, which traditionally have been able to download through their tender to their contractors. However, that is not possible anymore, or there's more risks with that, and it is ultimately the project leader's responsibility to ensure where the soil does end up going. So we've been heavily engaged with assisting in a lot of pre-tender project consultations to support soil management optimization. We've been educating the clients, just like this is a prime example today, on different soil classifications and reuse streams, and just trying to be involved as much as possible to ensure that soil is beneficially reused and people know their options out in the market. Next slide, please. Now looking into, I've touched on this a little bit, into our specifics. I've really focused on just our Toronto, or to the Toronto Construction Association areas of expertise and facilities. As I mentioned, we've been doing this for 15 years in Toronto, starting with our Pickering operation. All of our facilities in Toronto, we have 4, northwest, east, and south, essentially, going from Pickering down to waterfront Toronto area on Unwin, over by Sherway Gardens is our western location, and then in the north up to the 401 and Weston Road area. Traditionally, we've been licensed as an MECP waste transfer facility, or non-hazardous contaminated soils facility for bioremediation. However, we are also able to, with the new regulation, accept under the excess soil regime as soil processing or soil banking as a Class 1 soil management site. So all of our licensed facilities, there's 7 in Ontario, are also considered Class 1 soil management facilities. We do own and operate a couple of reuse sites, namely our site out in Mount Albert, north of in the East Gwillimbury area. It is a Table 2 industrial commercial permitted site. And those sites, those projects are reviewed and approved on a project-by-project basis. So a lot of heavy infrastructure projects have been disposing and utilizing the Mount Albert pit for their projects. Liquid soils are a new word or definition within the excess soil regulation. Essentially, liquid soils, they do not pass slump. They either have to be hydrovaced, carried away in hydrovacs, or they need to be solidified on site with a lot of QP oversight and approvals and sign-offs. So we do have 4 facilities in the GTA area that all have ECAs to receive liquid soil as well. Next slide, please. And then this is the final slide on my side, talking about why early engagement is important. With more characterization, which Mark mentioned, and Neil as well, we have more sampling, you have more options. Knowing what your options are, if you want to reuse the soil on site, don't need to excavate the soil, or if you're looking to offload the soil, there's new tools such as the BRAT tool for beneficial reuse at certain sites. Class 2 management sites are an option. Disposal at landfill is an option. Disposal at a Class 1 transfer site or soil remediation processing site is an option as well. And then sending it to a reuse site, traditionally a farmer's field. However, in lieu of Mark's clean fill wanted comment, those no longer are allowed. You need to ensure that they're permitted, licensed, and acceptable. The big thing about the Reg 406 is the receiving site needs to provide written consent. They need to be comfortable with the soil that's being generated from the project leader, the contract from the project site. So there are minimum requirements in the regulation that outline what needs to be shown. However, it's important to understand that each site may ask for additional information. They are allowed to do that. It's their right. In order for them to make a proper determination if they can receive their soil, if they want to take your soil. Some things to note about just receiving sites or your receiving site options is no two sites are the same. They all have different licenses, working within different municipalities, different permits. So it's really important to be looking at pre-qualifying, pre-approving sites early on to know what your limitations are. Is there a seasonal road restriction? Is the road paved? Can they take all the quality of soil that you're generating? With the more sampling, you're going to have different soil types potentially. So utilizing the least amount of sites as possible and also maximizing your dollars for efficiencies is important as well. Just a few recommendations to everyone on this seminar today. From the receiving site, traditionally we've seen calls, can you take our soil tomorrow? In the old days, yes, but however, with the new regulations and there's more involvement, more stakeholders, more reviews, more qualified professionals involved. So that won't be happening anymore. It's highly recommended to approach the receiving site as a partner, not as just a dumping site. There can be a lot of solutions up front to help better manage the soil. There are different pricing options based on the soil quality, and that's all important. And to understand up front, pre-tender stage, which will help benefit your project in the long run. Understanding which, if you've pre-approved or pre-qualified or pre-identified a desired receiving site that's close to your project, or a site that can take all of your types of soil, engaging with them early to ensure that you aren't oversampling is important. Give them exactly what they want. Is helpful, will help mitigate any problems when the shovels enter the ground. And if they cannot take all your soil or the soil that you're generating, what is your plan B? So do you have backup sites? Are you going to reuse it on site? Can you do some ground improvement? Do you need to do a temporary site for a class 2 potentially down the road to reuse it back at another project that you may have? So that's important as well. And then just again, with all these sites being different and having different variations, there are exemptions within the regulation. Talking to someone like Mark about the intricacies of the regulation and what your flexibilities are, what your options are, all can help early on really map out a successful project. And the earlier you engage with some of these people and these receiving sites, there could be a package of other services that could be coming together. Most notably, if the fill supply, backhauling is a large cost savings measure in the industry. If you don't have to, if you can pick up aggregate or soil of acceptable quality at the same site or close to it, then it's a beneficial cost savings measure. So in the end, there are options as receiving site options. There's a lot of new options out there, and just to pre-plan as early as possible because of all the involved stakeholders at the table now and the responsibilities of the project leader and the duration of how long that they have to carry that risk is very, very important to work with the right companies. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan, very much. And I do have a question, but I'll ask it after, and we'll get to Kevin now, and then we'll go to the Q&A component. So Kevin Goldberg, over to you. Kevin's going to provide insights about the importance of tracking excess soil.
All right, thanks a lot, Matt. And just to echo what everyone else is saying, thanks a lot, TCA, for putting this on, and the other panelists. So just a little bit about SoilFLO. So we're the leading earthwork software in Ontario. Each day we're moving thousands of loads. We work with owners, contractors, developers, QPs, and fill sites all the way through the chain of custody chain there. So next slide, please. So who are we used by right now? So we're across Canada from the Trans-Mountain expansion through, we have had some small projects in Nova Scotia. We work on very large infrastructure projects, generally extremely complex delineations, lots of stakeholders involved, lots of chain of custody tracking to be had. Like you can see on the left, we work with owners, contractors, and receivers of soil, big and small. And it's funny because we've kind of started with the biggest, and as these regulations come in, they were the first to adopt, and we're starting to see smaller and smaller contractors get on board as we approach these regulations. We can just keep going here, keep it brief. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the SoilFLO perspective on the new regs. I mean, we've heard about the enhanced testing, definition of qualified persons, not professionals, bit of a typo there, and the clear rules on managing levels of contamination and reuse. We really see the tracking and record keeping as kind of being the area where all of these rules, all of these requirements, and all the benefits really come together. And with proper tracking, with proper record keeping, you can leverage all of the early engagement data that you've been collecting for your benefit. So we know that we're going to have to be testing more on the site. There's increased sampling frequency. We know as owners that we're going to have to plan for where the soil is coming. We're going to have to register and really think ahead about where that's going. And then we're going to involve our QPs, generally qualified people now who are going to help us and advise us. So how do we take all this extra money that we're spending up front now and leverage it to have better outcomes during excavation to actually get a return on investment from these new regulations? Let's keep going here. So we look at the 40619 checklist. These are generally the information, the documents that we look to collect or that you should be collecting on a project in order to be in compliance with these new regulations. That soil management plan, doing the proper delineation to figure out where all of that soil is going to go, traffic and transportation plans, soil sampling and analysis. The written consent, as Ryan was talking about, is really important for liability. Written confirmation from each hauler that excess soil destination assessment report is a new report out now. Of course, development and implementation of a tracking system, full chain of custody hauling records, and then written notice of project end. The hard part here is ensuring proper collection and data retention for 7 years in a standardized way. So a lot of these companies that we work with, there will inevitably be turnover in a 7-year time. We have to look to make sure that this data is being collected in a standardized way, that it is accessible. So 6 years down the line, when the ministry comes knocking and says, hey, what's in that load of soil over there and that stockpile of soil, you know exactly what is in it. Just moving through. When we look at tracking, we're looking at 8 key points on a per truckload level. So we need the source site location, the time of dispatch, and the person who dispatched it. We need the truck details and the hauler details and the soil type, disposal location, time of receipt, and the person who received it. And of course, it has to be collected, stored, and managed. You know, when you look at these 8 data points, many of our clientele move in the hundreds, move in the thousands of loads per day. And when you look at collecting this information in kind of the old school legacy paper-based way and holding it and retaining it for 7 years, we're literally looking at hundreds of thousands of data points over a given year, sometimes for a specific project. So really important to think about how you're going to be collecting this information, how you're going to leverage your early planning to get a return on your investment when it comes to, or to actually save money when it comes to excavation and disposal of soils, and make sure that it's being stored in a standardized way. And I'm looking forward to talking about that with my panelists. Yeah, that's all I got for you for the introduction to SoilFLO, and looking forward to having our discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. And I think we'll, there it is. We'll go to Q&A now, but here's our contact information for the panelists and for me. And you'll have the slide deck and the recording, so you can take down this information. If you have questions for any of the panelists after the program today, please don't hesitate to reach out to them, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions now. So we've got a few in the Q&A. And I think I'll start with the first, and I'd love others' thoughts on this generally, but Jennifer's asked the question, in terms of grandfathering exemptions for previously executed contracts, what date applies? So the answer to that is January 1, 2022. And just for the folks out there who are wondering what that grandfathering means, it means that there are two phases to the regulation. There are two main components. There's what's in place right now that applies to all projects where excess soil is generated. And then there's a second phase that applies to more onerous, larger, more complicated projects. Projects that do not fall within an exemption otherwise, that's set out in a list of exemptions in the regulation, where you need to file notice on the registry being an excess soil specific registry that's being prepared as we speak and will be in place by Jan 1, 2022. So there's a grandfathering exemption under the regulation that allows for projects dealing with excess soil to be executed and in place before January 1, 2022. And if you are a project that otherwise would have to file notice on the registry, and with that have a formal tracking system per the requirements of the regulation, having planning requirements in place, including preparation of up to 4 different reports by Mark Priddle and other qualified persons. Those requirements you're exempt from, those more onerous requirements, if you have your executed contract in place before Jan 1, 2022. And that exemption applies all the way out to Jan 1, 2026. At which point, if you have a project that's ongoing after that and you're still dealing with excess soil, you're arguably no longer exempt. Any comments on that, panelists? The grandfathering process? Maybe I'll ask the question, have you seen or advised some of your clients or colleagues or whoever about that grandfathering process? And is there sort of a rush to get these contracts in place before Jan 1, 2022?
Yeah, with municipalities and MTO, there has been lots of questions about that and a bit of a rush. We've provided one caution again, like you said, Matt, that if it is a very large infrastructure project and a contract's awarded before January 1st, 2022, but it's going to be 5 years, then you're not exempt because it will be ongoing after 2026. So be careful.
I had a recent discussion with a contractor on this, actually, where we were talking about the grandfathering exemptions, and they can go ahead and grandfather it on some of these projects, and that's fine. But I don't think the contractors particularly like it, because we're still seeing the owners trying to download that liability, and in some cases in an unfair way against the regulation onto the contractors. So I think it's always important to bring it back to the purpose of this regulation and what we're trying to accomplish. And does rushing a contract to be made, at this time for an excavation that's premature prior to being able to properly plan out those receiving sites and having all that information in place, is it really worth it? How is it going to be received by the contractors? And, what are the repercussions down the line of rushing that contract through?
Great. There's an easy question. I'll just answer it right now. Define a qualified person. So we keep using this phrase, and it's a good question. So a qualified person is the same as defined under OREG 15304, the record of site condition regulation. It's a professional geoscientist like Mark, or a professional engineer in Ontario. So I'd like to just touch upon, before we go through a number of questions that we have here, something that Ryan spoke to, and that is he was speaking to Class 1 soil management sites and Class 2 soil management sites, these interim sites for storage and or processing. And Ryan, I'm hoping maybe you can just elaborate on the general difference between the two and how it works under the regulation.
For sure. In short, I'm going to start with a Class 2. A Class 2 site is a temporary storage site that is owned by the project leader. So essentially the project leader is taking soil off of their project area and taking it to a temporary storage site that they own. A Class 2 site can only receive soils from projects that the project leader owns. So you can't be receiving third-party soils, whereas a Class 1 soil management site is a facility that has an instrument, like a permit or a license, that can receive soils for either soil banking, so temporary stockpiling, or soil processing. Bioremediation is one example, from outside parties that they're not the project leader on.
Thank you. Excellent. Why don't we go to Mark's second question? So he's asking about, Mark, Ryan, Neil, and Kevin, what's been your overall response of the construction industry to the new excess soil regulatory framework? How are you going about impressing upon those in the industry the need to learn and apply the new rules? How do you respond to resistance to change, given that the excess soil rules are so new and different and prescriptive? And I think that that will actually cover off lessons learned as well. Maybe we can each speak to those 2 points. Why don't we start with Kevin?
Oh, okay. So, you know, we've been at this for pretty much 4 years now, and really the tone has changed throughout the industry in all aspects of it. I think right now where we're at is everybody knows that this regulation is coming. You know, we still have people who aren't necessarily happy about it, but I think that the majority of contractors, for example, who were originally giving kind of the most resistance to it, the ones that I'm working with and speaking to, are now welcoming the regulation. It's giving a level playing field to the industry where generally there was not always a level playing field. It provides consistency in their contracts and their language. There's clear guidelines and accountability when it comes to liability, and we have lawyers educating those at the top, the owners, that this is how the liability is changing, right? So at this point, I would say the industry is really receptive. Within the past 6 months, we've seen tremendous uptake in all aspects of the regulation, adoption of new testing procedures in contracts, through to proper sign-offs and consent and tracking, of course. So at this point, I'd say it's being received very well by the industry. It's just about education.
Great. Neil, any thoughts? Lessons learned?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is a lot of early engagement. We're seeing it from a lot of levels, municipal for sure, private developers. I think it's never been more important than to engage with your geotechnical engineer, engage with your environmental engineer early in the process. When you identify that you have challenging soils on site that may become, you know, excess soils, looking at your options, bringing in your specialty subtrades early. And I think that's really what we're seeing is a lot of projects really early on in the pipeline. So not just out for tender, but they may be 2-3 years away, and we're having the opportunity to come in and talk about strategies that might assist them. And I think that the reception has been very very positive, and it's great to see it. We talked a little bit here about the MTO. You know, the MTO has always been great about pre-planning even before the regulations, and we're just seeing that extend to more and more public entities.
Yeah, and Mark, you were speaking specifically to MTO as a large excess soil generator, of course, yeah. And maybe you can expand on that too from your perspective.
Yeah, so it's still a little bit of a learning curve even for the MTO, and like Neil said, some projects that we're working on started 4 years ago before excess soils is really thought about, so they're trying to get up to speed with that, especially if it's going to be tendered even in 2022. We helped a public sector client with a tender, and the winning contractor put in a great bid. They had a draft excess soil management plan, had the name and address of 3 sites for 3 different classes of soil. Worked out quite well. So there are people know what's going on in the contracting field. Some of the bigger projects where there's a lot of fingers in the pie and things like that, a little bit more of a learning curve, and sort of educating the project leader a bit more about their responsibilities, I think, is a big one.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, Ryan, if you have, please, lessons learned. I know you spoke to some already, but.
Yeah, just going to play off of pretty much what Mark and Neil and Kevin have said. You know, with more characterization, you know, you have more options, more soil types. It's not a blanket approach anymore. So I think once the project, we've been following this regulation for 4 years, like Kevin mentioned, it's been delayed on its rollout. We are seeing a lot of early adoption. I think the project leaders that have been following it and jumped on it initially as soon as January 1st hit have reaped the benefits. And at this point, you know, bluntly, there's no excuse to not know about this regulation if you're moving soil or if you're in the construction industry. So it's here, and it's going to definitely open up and become more transparent on illegal dumping, which is a root cause of why this was generated. So and ensuring responsibility and liability on everyone.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. So there's a couple of things to unpack from this question, but I'd like to see if anybody has an answer about reuse sites. So the question is, from what I understand, there are many reuse sites that have their own tracking system to meet the regulation. Is there a list somewhere of reuse sites and the platform they're using? The platform, I guess, being the tracking system they're using. I'd like to maybe hand it over to Kevin to speak to where we're at with the registry and if there's any public information available for reuse sites, I guess, for tracking software, for information like that for industry. And if there's not yet, what do we think might be coming? I've heard that the registry may even include some information about available reuse sites for matching, I think. Kev, maybe you
Yeah,
can
so I think in terms of the registry's in development. You know, the commitment it's being developed by the Resource Productivity Recovery Alliance of Ontario. That is RIPRA. It's a third-party arm's length government organization. If I got that right, hopefully legally that's right, Matt. And they've committed to the basic forms of the registry being ready to go for beta testing by December, I believe, but definitely ready to implement for the new regulation. That's going to be the first step, is the most basic information required under the regs, registration of both source and receiving sites when applicable under the new regulation. In terms of tracking systems and different receiving sites using their own tracking systems, absolutely. Different receiving sites have their own tracking systems, including Ryan and GFL. When it comes to our perspective on that, is you always want to be in control of your own data and be able to have it on a standardized system to collect all of that information. So it's just important to make sure that whatever system you're using internally, in-house, whether or not you're source or receiving, you're able to tie in and collect information on the other end and make sure it all matches and reconciles for the new regulation. And we have the proper tools in place to do that. So that's what I have to say about that.
Ryan, anything to add?
Yeah, there's lots of options, and I'll touch on the sourcing reuse sites and the registry, which Kevin and I are both a part of the stakeholder group there. There are new innovative tools and technologies out there. You know, digital tracking is a popular one, but also we're starting to see an emergence of online tools for broadcasting reuse sites. Dirtmarket.ca is one that we've started advertising our sites on. It's a soil marketplace. So there's other people emerging into that space. So there's a plethora of tools to support beneficial reuse and to essentially divert soil that cannot go to landfill, clean soil as of 2026, I do believe.
Great. One of the questions we have here is about minimum. So are there exemptions for sites with minimum soil removal? In other words, a soil volume minimum. I don't know if anybody would like to speak to that. I can just say briefly that it doesn't matter what project it is. It could be a backyard swimming pool. The minimum volume of soil components of the regulation apply again to whether you have to file notice on the registry or not. And in different scenarios, there's 100 meters cubed scenario where you're potentially exempt. There's a 2,000 meter cube exemption, but it depends on other criteria. And that's set out in the exemptions from having to file notice on the registry. But when it comes to having to comply with the non-registry component, the sort of phase one that we're in right now of the regulation, there's no minimum soil volume that applies. Any thoughts on that, panelists? Anything to add?
That's correct, Matt. It does cause a bit of consternation with like a homeowner and things like that. But I can't say anymore, but.
Yeah, no, for sure. Okay, and I think I'd like to open this up quickly to the panel. We don't have much time, but there's a question for me, but I think we can all speak to it. Of course, not from the legal perspective, panelists, but I'll do the legal piece first. Where in the excess soil regulatory framework do you expect lies the greatest exposure to regulatory liability and inspections and investigations by the regulatory authority, which is the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks? And I would answer that broadly by saying that there are multiple places within the regulation that are quite prescriptive, quite administrative, that that if you do not comply with those, it can give rise to low-hanging fruit, to easily investigations and potentially charges for what are really administrative offenses for not following the many steps in the regulation and the soil rules. And there are quite a few, but once you get a handle on it, you have your systems in place, and the you being anyone involved in the process. In particular, project leaders, who are those who have ultimate responsibility to comply with the regulation, first and foremost, absolutely. But if there are other elements within the regulation where others involved have to do something, Class 1 soil management sites need an ECA. You obviously need the ECA if you're accepting soil as a Class 1 soil management site, for example. And both individuals and companies can be investigated, can be charged, can be convicted, and have to pay fines. So broad strokes, that's the answer, but there's a lot of devil in the details within this regulation and the soil rules that industry needs to be apprised of to make sure that you're complying. And if you have your systems in place, that's the best thing you can do to train personnel, to have standard operating procedures, to try to prevent this from happening. And if it does, you may have a due diligence defense if you are prosecuted. Anything to add, panelists, on that last point?
Just wondered, Matt, just to re-emphasize the project leader and the ultimate responsibility and the inability, I guess maybe, Matt, you'd answer this more, but to legally download that to the contractor, how that's not, that's not playing ball anymore. So it is the owner, the developer of the site, wherever they're taking their soil, they're responsible for. And then there's a legacy of responsibility if it goes to a reuse site, Class 1 site, landfill. So it is the new regulation. It's a heavy focus on the generator of the soil.
Yeah.
If I could add one more thing, Matt,
Please.
for us, when it comes to liability, it's all about evidence and real-time decision-making and real-time knowledge of what's happening on your site. So traditionally, you won't know if your truck made it to a facility, to a receiving site 30, 60, 90 days later until you reconcile that information, and then your load of soil is under, another 60 loads of dirt or 600 loads of dirt. So having information at your fingertips in real time, being able to make quick decision making, and having QPs being able to access that information to protect you, they're just there trying to help you. So have the tools available, plan early, and cover yourself for liability so you don't end up there.
Yeah, well said. I'll do the plug for Mark, so you don't have to, Mark Priddle. QPs are integral to this process, and I completely agree with what Kevin said. There are a number of, we're unfortunately out of time. There are a number of questions still. What I suggest is when everybody receives the recording, you'll get the contact information. There's a questions, for example, about testing for shale that Mark Priddle could probably answer quite easily. So please reach out to any of the speakers if you have specific questions. And we'll just turn it over now to Sophia to give us some closing remarks on TCA's behalf. Sophia.
Thank you, Matthew, and a big thank you on behalf of the YCL and TCA to all of you who've taken the time to join us today, and to our panelists for sharing their experiences boot to ground in the industry so far. You can find the recording for this presentation on the YouTube channel for TCA, which will be posted later on today, as well as the newsletter July 2nd, which will have a short briefing of the panel discussion today. Thank you all again, and have a fantastic day.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.